So I'm Alex Chin. The title of this talk is Shaving My Head Made Me a Better Programmer, and it's a little bit misleading. So this is a two-part talk, and the first part tells the story of how I became passionate about building diverse and inclusive environments in tech, and then the second part teaches you how to do just that. And so I know this is an international crowd, so I apologize for some of my American nerd pop culture references. It's okay if you don't laugh at my jokes. Hi, I'm Alex Chin. I'm a software engineer and an educator, and I care a lot about access to computer science education and about leveraging technology to create social change, and I'm going to tell you about how that happened and some of the stuff that I learned along the way. So I'm originally from Paris, France. Bonjour. Any French people in the audience? Okay. I started programming in college. That's why I went to the United States, and I live in Brooklyn now. And I wanted to be an astronaut at the time. So I joined the engineering program at my school, and one of the requirements was introduction to programming. And I fell in love with programming immediately. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced. I felt like I could be creative and analytical all at the same time. I felt like I'd finally found an art form with which I could express myself. So I was really excited. And I started programming and immediately decided to major in computer science. And that was an easy decision because I loved it. But staying in computer science was not so easy. And it wasn't because learning to code is hard, which it is. You're essentially, working with a machine that's telling you over and over that you're failing. Y'all know. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part, the main obstacles that I had to overcome were other people's perceptions and my own perceptions about my abilities as a programmer. And so at the time, I was one of maybe 5 women in my computer science classes, and there were some classes where I was the only woman. I hadn't been programming since I was 10. Most of the people in my class, parents were programmers, and so it was really lonely. And even though I did really well in all of my classes, no one wanted to work with me. People didn't want to interact with me on an intellectual level. It felt like being hyper-visible and invisible at the same time. They didn't believe I was a programmer, really, the other people in my program. They'd ask me, "Are you really? Prove it. Do you know what a terminal is?" And I didn't believe it myself. Until senior year of college, when people asked me if I was a programmer, I'd say, not really, but I'm trying to become one, which is silly because the act of programming is what makes you a programmer. And so there were 2 things at play there. There was people discriminating against me because I didn't look like what they thought a programmer should look like, and my own imposter syndrome. And for those of us who aren't familiar, imposter syndrome is when someone feels like a fraud because they think that they've convinced the people around them that they've accomplished stuff and they're skilled and worthy, but they actually aren't. And that's how I felt. So anyway, I was really stubborn, and I decided I was going to become a really good programmer in a way that was unquestionable to the world. So I joined the programming team and started running our computer club and took all the hardest classes at my school and finally became accepted by my peers. And it's ridiculous that I had to do all of this stuff for that to happen, and other people could just show up and look nerdy to be accepted, but I didn't care because I made it. So then I graduated from college, and I got my first full-time job as a software engineer at a startup in New York. It was a really great job. I felt super accomplished. I learned about front-end engineering there. I made really great friends. I got to be a part of a tiny team and have a huge impact on the whole product and on the company as a whole, and it was awesome. But one thing wasn't so awesome. Whenever I stepped out of my great job bubble and entered the tech world, went to programming conferences like this one, went to meetups and events, and as our company grew and we hired more people, the same stuff that used to happen to me in college started happening to me again, all the time, everywhere I went. And some of it was small stuff, like microaggressions, which I'll cover later, like people asking me over and over if I was sure that I was a programmer, even though I was at a programming conference, wearing a badge. And also some bigger, scarier, more serious stuff. And it got so prevalent at some point that I became really discouraged, and I asked myself, why do I love programming so much if programming doesn't love me back? And I was just trying to do my job, just trying to write code, and the environment wasn't really allowing me to do that. And I seriously considered quitting, quitting programming and becoming one of the over 40% of women who leave software at some point in their career, which would have been really sad because I love it and I'm good at it. So as I said before, I'm really stubborn, so I decided, again, I'm going to try and find a solution. So I sought out my friends for advice, and I actually realized that I only had male programmer friends at the time, which, is wild looking back now because I have a lot of friends from all different backgrounds in programming now. So I decided I'm going to meet as many female software engineers as possible. So I got friends to introduce me to female software engineers at the companies where they worked, and I just went on blind coffee dates with a ton of women, and some of them became really great friends. And I was really looking for advice on how to deal with, feeling invisible and hypervisible, and looking to create a support network. And so I asked them, what do I do? How do I deal with the way people are treating me in my profession just because of the way I look? And I got a lot of different advice. Some was helpful, some was less helpful. Like, everyone really sympathized with me and knew what I was going through. And this one lady who had been a software engineer for about 10 years and who was now like CTO, she told me when she cut her hair, men stopped harassing her at tech conferences. So I was like, okay, that's not super applicable to me. Like, I'm not going to do that. And then this one male friend of mine, who was really just trying to help me and give me good advice, he said, why don't you become a really badass programmer? Like this one lady programmer, Sarah Chips, she's pretty famous in JavaScript in New York. Become really badass like her, become known for your expertise, and people will have to take you seriously. They won't have a choice but to give you respect. And so I thought, okay, I can try that. So I started giving talks at meetups about something I'm really passionate about, which is accessibility on the web, which is the concept of making the web more accessible to folks with disabilities. So like blind people, people who can't use a mouse, old people. It's a really important subject. And it went really well. And after a few local meetups, I even got invited to speak at a really big programming conference, a big JavaScript conference. And people were flying from all around the country and like different countries to attend, and tickets cost hundreds of dollars, kind of like this conference. And I got to share the stage with people I really respect, people whose tools I used every day. And I was certainly the youngest person giving a talk there. So I was really excited and I felt super accomplished. It was a really big deal, like I was finally badass. So I gave my talk and it went really well, and people learned about the important stuff that I had to say about accessibility, and I felt really good about it. But then the first thing that I got asked after I gave my talk was, this guy, he asked me, how do I talk to women at bars? And I was floored. I couldn't believe it. Because even after all the work that I'd done to get there, even in the moment when my expertise was undeniable, like I was literally on stage teaching him things that he paid money to learn about, even in that moment I wasn't seen as a programmer. So being a badass didn't help me. I still didn't get any respect. And at this point I was really fed up. I was so sick of being treated that way because of my appearance. But I'm a hacker, so I decided I'm going to hack my appearance. So I shaved my head. And this was before Stranger Things. So it wasn't as cool back then. And now it's like every other woman in Brooklyn is like shaving her head. So anyway, I shaved my head, and the weirdest thing happened. Like overnight, I became a really good programmer. I stopped getting hit on at tech conferences, and people listened to me and respected me and stopped doubting me. I stopped being this mix of hypersexualized and underskilled programmer, and I'd walk into a room filled with other programmers, and they'd look to me for expertise, and they'd say like, "Oh, you're technical. What do you think of this?" And I couldn't believe it because that was the first time that had happened. And I tried to think about it scientifically, like, is there something in hair that makes me worse at being a programmer? Like maybe my hair was weighing me down, like dragging my programming skills down. But no. Because this guy, Richard Stallman, is a really good programmer. And This is Max Ogden. He's also a really good programmer, and he has a shit ton of hair. And this is Serial from the movie Hackers. And he has long hair, too. Great movie, by the way. So it had nothing to do with my hair, obviously. But now I was suddenly considered to be a good programmer. And what had changed then? It wasn't my actual abilities. They hadn't changed overnight. It was the way that I was being perceived by my peers. I was no longer this hyper-feminine lady who didn't belong. I didn't look very feminine. I dressed androgynously at the time as well to match my look, and people even mistook me and my boyfriend for a gay couple once. And so I didn't present as feminine anymore, so it was okay for me to be a programmer, and even it was acceptable for me to be a good programmer. And this was like a mind-blowing discovery for me because even though I knew that I was a good programmer, and I knew about sexism in tech, now I had proof of this on a really personal level. So I did a lot more thinking about this. Like I knew there's a problem in my environment that doesn't allow capable, passionate people like me to succeed, regardless of their abilities. And I thought, what can I do about it? So I decided I can teach and mentor other people who don't fit the status quo, who don't look like what a programmer looks like, so that at a certain point we can change the status quo, and then you won't be able to say, this person doesn't look like a coder. And so I started teaching on the side as a volunteer. I taught at high school for kids who were recent immigrants in the Bronx, and I taught a lot of workshops for women, and specifically women of color, and I really found a passion for education. And so I decided to stop writing code full-time and join this programming school as a curriculum director. Coalition for Queens is a free, intensive programming bootcamp for adults from underrepresented backgrounds with no programming experience. And I was hired to help launch the program, and it was really ambitious. We had a really successful pilot. 50% of the class was women, 50% were immigrants, 50% had no college degrees, 50% were Black and Latino. And the average income of the class when it started was around $25,000 a year. And after the program, the graduates went on to work at Pinterest, Spotify, BuzzFeed. And some of them make like upwards of $120,000 a year now. So that's like a really life-changing thing. And throughout this process, I learned the most important lesson about teaching and about programming. I learned that we need to stop thinking that there's only one kind of person who can be excellent at programming. Greatness in programming can come from anywhere, and anyone can achieve excellence if you give them support, if you give them a safe space to learn, and if you trust that they can do it. And since the pilot ended, I've decided to broaden my impact on education, which is why I joined the Skillshare engineering team. Skillshare is a continuing education platform, and there I lead our innovation engineering team. And as a teacher, I had strongly believed that there's a way to create diverse and inclusive environments in which people from all backgrounds can succeed. And at Skillshare, I've seen it in practice. Before Skillshare, I'd only ever been the only woman on an engineering team. But I'm really excited to say that at Skillshare, our engineering team is 45% women, and our engineering leadership is actually 60% women, which is amazing and like almost unheard of. And it takes serious commitment to create an environment like that where everyone can succeed, and that's what I'll talk about more in the second part of my talk. And then outside of work, I continue to teach children and adults to code through various organizations, but most recently I've started my own educational program called the Code Cooperative, in which former inmates learn to code as a means to creating social change. And so most of them have been in prison for a long time. They've all been released from prison recently, and they've all received laptops donated from New York tech companies, and they're all working on projects that have to do with criminal justice reform, which is really exciting. And so that's kind of my background. Other than that, I give a lot of talks about why I think tech should be more diverse and inclusive, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. I'll share how you can build inclusive environments on your teams. So throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about building diverse and inclusive environments. And so let's do a quick check on the vocab. A diverse environment is one where people from all backgrounds have equal representation. And an inclusive environment is one where people from all backgrounds receive equal treatment and equal opportunity by design. And then I'm going to allude to different underrepresented groups in tech to draw examples from. Those groups differ from country to country. So in the US, groups that are typically underrepresented in tech are women, people of color, and by that I generally mean black and brown folks, folks who identify as LGBTQ, immigrants, older folks, disabled folks, parents, and then all these groups of people encounter different kinds of challenges, and those who belong to multiple groups have compounded challenges that they deal with. And so in your environment, people who are underrepresented in software might belong to different groups. For example, in the US, people who are from Southeast Asia are very underrepresented in tech. However, if you're from the Philippines, that doesn't make sense. So instead of being specific, I'll try to talk to use like a kind of blanket terms to refer to underrepresented groups in tech. And so none of these terms are really perfect, but I'll use them interchangeably anyway. So I'll use the words like underrepresented groups and minorities. Women are generally underrepresented in tech in most countries, so I'll use that group as an example a lot. Is anyone here from like work in an environment where women are generally have equal representation as men? Okay, all right. So good for y'all. So now we have a shared vocabulary, and I'll talk more about how we can build diverse and inclusive environments. So the first and most important part of building a diverse and inclusive work environment is just caring. And that seems easy, but it's not that simple. You have to genuinely care about this issue and really commit to what that means. Real measurable results will only happen if your organization is externally and internally committed to making a positive change. You need to care, and everyone in your organization needs to care. Your CEO, middle management, individual contributors. Otherwise, when it comes to making difficult decisions like who to hire between two candidates or whether or not you should fire the high performer who's harassing people on the team, you're going to make a counterproductive decision if you're not 100% committed. And if that's the case, your efforts will ultimately be ineffective. For example, Google just released their latest diversity report. And after 2 years and $250 million, they admitted that they didn't make any significant progress in terms of racial diversity. Only 2% of their workforce is black compared to 13% in the United States. And that number didn't change after 2 years and $250 million, which seems almost impossible. Or take Uber, who has recently come under fire for allegations of sexual harassment from one of their senior software engineers, Susan Fowler. This is a huge scandal, and it's having disastrous impact on Uber's brand and on its ability to do business. Hundreds of Uber employees have quit. Some Uber investors have come forward writing about how disappointed they are in Uber. And the hashtag delete Uber movement has picked up speed again and has had a significant impact on app usage and app downloads. And I encourage you all to read Susan Fowler's story. So what I'm saying is you really need to care and commit in order to make changes that won't just help the women and other minorities in your environment, but will benefit your entire team and your company as a result. But why should you care? I hope that after hearing my story and about how hard it was for me to succeed, even though I loved coding and I was really good at it and worked really hard, I hope that after hearing that story, you would care a little bit more. But this isn't about me, so you need to find your own reason to care about tech's lack of equality. And I'm going to start with giving some bad reasons why you should care. These reasons are not the best. Because you have to? No. Because of PR, branding? Because it's charitable? No. These aren't great because when it comes down to it, these won't matter as much as your bottom line, right? So these aren't really easy to rally people around. But there are some better reasons to care about this. If you want to make a lot of money, studies have shown that diverse teams drive more innovation. They're more successful and ultimately make more money. They consistently outperform non-diverse teams. If you want to have the best team, when you build your culture for inclusion, you will attract the best and most talented people. Top candidates want to join diverse companies. And we can build better teams if we hire from diverse pools because they're untapped. Teams should reflect the population that they aim to serve, which in the case of many tech companies is the whole world. Otherwise, you end up with severe blind spots, like when Apple Maps launched without public transportation, or when Apple Health launched without the ability to track your menstrual cycle, or when Google Photos launched with image recognition that labeled pictures of black people as gorillas. This happened. This could have been really easily avoided. Or in a more serious case, the first airbags weren't tested with women's frames in mind, so they ended up killing a bunch of women. And this could have all been avoided if the team had had folks from different backgrounds and perspectives. So the last and maybe the most important reason to care is that you care about equality, and hopefully this is true about all of us here in this room. Outside of just being a product and business necessity, we need to acknowledge that the lack of diversity in tech is a symptom of systemic discrimination. And if we care about equality, we must do our best to counteract it. So it doesn't really matter what your reason is for caring about fixing tech's lack of diversity, but hopefully one of those reasons resonated with you. So okay, once you care, once you're committed, what should you do? The second step to building a diverse and inclusive team is not to take action yet. It's to listen, learn, and probably make a bunch of mistakes. And by listen, learn, and make mistakes, I mean specifically listen to those with less privilege than you, learn about their experiences, and make mistakes and learn from them. And if you were at Anhuan's talk earlier today, then you know a little bit more about privilege. So as engineers, we love to figure out and fix things ourselves. In the case of diversity and inclusion, it's super important to listen to those with less privilege before we take action. Don't make assumptions about someone's experience, and resist the urge to speak for an underrepresented group that you don't belong to. Because when those with more privilege center our own voices, even when we have good intentions, even when we're trying to protect people with less privilege, we're perpetuating the system that we're trying to dismantle. So instead of taking center stage, highlight and amplify the voices of those with less privilege around you. How do you find these voices to listen to? So if your Twitter feed looks more like this, follow women, women of color, disabled folks, queer, trans, gender nonconforming folks on Twitter. Seriously. And remember that a big part of listening to someone is understanding the personal impact of speaking up and of whistleblowing before you discredit someone's personal story. One of the most important rules of building software, which we forget like 90% of the time, is that you need to understand a problem in order to fix it. So learn about the experiences of underrepresented groups before you tackle the problem. Learn about the challenges they face. As I mentioned earlier, different minority groups encounter different challenges, and people who belong to multiple groups encounter compounded challenges. But we can still talk about a few common challenges that underrepresented groups face. So the first one I want to talk about is imposter syndrome. I mentioned imposter syndrome earlier in my talk, and I want to spend a little bit more time talking about it. So this pie chart nicely represents how someone with imposter syndrome might feel. Imposter syndrome is a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. It's an incorrect assessment of one's abilities compared to your peers. For example, you think you're a 3 at programming when actually you're a 7. You feel like you're constantly at risk of being found out, and although everyone can suffer from imposter syndrome, it's much more prevalent in members of minority groups. So why does this matter? It matters because imposter syndrome can have really serious effects on someone's career. For example, it might lead someone to not apply for a job or for a promotion, or not submit papers to conferences or journals, or underestimate their experience or skills. It can lead to higher stress. It can lead to attributing successes to chance or luck instead of your own work. It can lead to over-preparing for tasks. And it can make you nervous about talking to others in your field if you think that they're higher skilled than you. And all of these things combined, you can see how they would have a disastrous impact on someone's career. So why does imposter syndrome occur? It's not simply because some people just lack confidence, which is often what it's attributed to. A lot of the time, imposter syndrome is a reaction to being consistently told that you're not good enough. For example, even though I was almost always first in my class in college, when my peers and teachers kept telling me that I wouldn't become a software engineer, I started to believe it. And I was a really confident person before that. So we must not blame people who have imposter syndrome and simply tell them to gain confidence, because that's not going to work. It's hard to build confidence when you're consistently given signals that you shouldn't be confident. And we'll talk more about this, how to address this later. Unconscious bias is really at the root of why a lot of discrimination happens in our lives. Maybe some of you have heard this brain teaser. A man and his son get into a car accident and they are rushed to surgery, to the hospital. The son is taken to surgery and the surgeon looks at the boy, stops and says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son. How is this possible?" The surgeon is his mother, yes. Points for you. In this case, the idea of the joke is that we would think the surgeon is a man. That's an example of unconscious bias. So unconscious biases are stereotypes about certain groups of people that form outside of conscious awareness. It's more prevalent than conscious bias, which is like when you're directly saying like, women are bad at math, right? Which is not true. And generally, unconscious bias doesn't reflect our conscious values. So for example, I don't think that men are better surgeons than women or that there are only men surgeons, but when I'm asked to picture a surgeon, I might just immediately think of a man. And unconscious biases form from messages that we've received throughout life, and they don't necessarily reflect our belief system. And almost everyone has measurable biases, but almost no one thinks that they do, and that's the problem. You can think of unconscious bias as mental shortcuts for the situations we experience every day. And most of the time, we actively work against those biases so that we're not like terrible people. So when we're tired, hungry, or multitasking, it's harder for us to work against our unconscious bias. And we can have unconscious biases against groups that we even belong to. For example, early in my career, when I saw another woman at a programming conference, I would immediately just assume that she was not a programmer. Like I would think she was working for the conference or like in marketing or something, which is ridiculous because I didn't think that when I saw a man at the conference, and that happened to me all the time. So we can suffer from unconscious biases against groups that we even belong to. Another example, a study was conducted where science faculty were asked to evaluate job applications for lab managers, where the only variance was the gender in the name. So it was the exact same resume, literally the same, just changed the name from like, Kenny to like Alexandra. And both male and female faculty that were reviewing the resumes rated male applicants more highly and gave them higher salaries than their female counterparts by $3,000, which is really significant. So the first step in addressing our biases is being aware of them. And there are some tests that you can take on the internet to like elucidate your unconscious biases, and they're really illuminating. Once we know about our biases, we can work to counter them. Another common challenge that minority groups face in tech is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat refers to the risk of confirming a negative stereotype about one's group. We have multiple identities, so I'm a woman, I'm Chinese, I'm Filipina, I'm French, and we respond to the identity under threat. So it's the idea that I will perform in accordance to a negative stereotype about a group I belong to in a situation where I'm reminded of it. And this can happen even when a stereotype isn't explicitly mentioned. So in the US, you may not know this, but there's a stereotype that women are not as good at math as men, which is weird to me because I grew up in France and that wasn't the case in France. And in the US, there's also a stereotype that people of Asian descent don't speak very good English. So a study was conducted where a group of Asian women of similar math and English aptitude took a math and English test. When they were asked to disclose their race before the test, the women did worse on the English portion. And when they were asked to disclose their gender, they did worse on the math portion. And no one even reminded them of this stereotype, and they didn't even, tell them, like, you're a woman, you're bad at math. They were just reminded of it by having to fill out that question. And so stereotype threat can have a serious impact on one's ability to perform in school, during an interview, and even on the job. So microaggressions are small, subtle, often subconscious actions that marginalize people in oppressed groups. While a few microaggressions, like someone asking me, like, where are you really from? Or are you really a programmer? Like, that might not seem like a big deal. the steady stream of them that people in minority groups experience all the time forms a really strong feeling of othering and of being marginalized. They send a distinct message that you're not normal, that you're less than, that you're other, that you don't belong. The experience of microaggressions as a woman in tech has been referred to by Julie Pagano as death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so the idea is that one paper cut isn't so bad at all, but 1,000 might kill you. So when someone comes to you and complains about a microaggression, like a shitty comment in a PR review, it's easy to sweep it under the rug and say it doesn't matter. But it's important to understand the impact of the aggregate of microaggressions and the effect that all of them combined can have on an individual in their work. Another common challenge that folks from underrepresented groups experience is erasure, or being forgotten about, not being credited for their work. For example, although software is a male-dominated field, as I can clearly see in this room, and most people identify programming with men, women actually invented programming. Ada Lovelace was the first person to describe how computing machines could solve math problems in the 1800s. So erasure happens because the people with most privilege are those who have the power to write history and to give credit to the contributions of minorities. And when we don't make it a point to do that, we erase voices in history. And this is the whole concept of the smash film Hidden Figures, which is a really awesome film. You should all see it. And it's the highest grossing film, by the way, of this Oscar season. It's the unknown story of 3 African-American women who were NASA engineers who played a huge role in one of the most important space missions in American history. And it's already inspired thousands of young girls to pursue science. And literally, I did not know that this happened at all. No one I know knew about this story. So the last challenge I want to talk about is lack of representation in leadership. One thing that often gets neglected when talking about diversity in tech is the percentage of minorities in leadership positions. Yeah, it's great if your team is 45% women, but if there are no women in leadership positions, are you really providing equal opportunities? People in leadership have the power to create opportunities and mentor people on their team. And having a mentor within your company is one of the most powerful tools for your career growth. But you're much less likely to find support from leadership if no one in leadership looks like you or has the same background as you. So companies without diverse leadership are much less likely to provide the same amount of opportunities for mentorship for minorities on their teams. And this tweet pretty much summarizes what lack of representation feels like. So these are the common challenges that I've talked about, and we can begin to address them on our teams. So a key part of making positive change is being okay with making mistakes and learning from them. As programmers, it's really hard to admit that we've made mistakes, I think. But if you think about it, the whole concept of building tech is about making mistakes and learning from them. That's why we conduct user research, that's why we write tests, that's why we QA, that's why we iterate. So let's approach inclusion work with the same attitude. It's okay and even encouraged to make mistakes, as long as you acknowledge them and learn from them and don't make the exact same mistake again. And building inclusive environments requires a lot of trust and openness, because it's sometimes an uncomfortable process. So creating a safe space for people to make mistakes is really important. And in the spirit of making mistakes and learning from them, I will share some of the mistakes that I've made, some of the statements that I've made about diversity in tech, and kind of explain why they were wrong and what I learned. So there's this common thing known as the pipeline problem, which is like saying, you know, I'd love to have more women on my team, but there just aren't that many who are interested in it. That's the pipeline problem. And many people will talk about this problem when talking about the lack of people from underrepresented groups in tech. And it refers to the notion that diversity in tech doesn't exist because there's a lack of qualified candidates because those people weren't interested in the first place. This is completely false. And it's been debunked by everyone, right? So the truth is, in 1986, women held 37% of CS degrees, and that has dropped to 18% today. Women have always been interested in computer science. They even invented computer science, but they've been pushed out. And now over 40% of women leave software at some point in their career. Similarly, in the US, 15% of CS graduates are Black and Latino, and yet only 4% of the programming workforce is Black and Latino. Some have used this pipeline metaphor to describe how women and other minorities get pushed out of STEM, and it's referred to as the leaky pipeline. And this drawing kind of describes that. Like, you see how there's like women that go through the pipeline, but then the pipeline is leaky, so at the end it's mostly men. Another thing that I've said is, coder is gender and race blind. Like, I used to believe this. That's what I thought I loved about programming, right? Like, programs, they don't have a gender and race, and when you're writing code, you're just evaluated by the compiler. But code doesn't run in a vacuum. Oops, this is a GIF. All right. Code doesn't run in a vacuum, and we have to take into account the cultural context in which we write and evaluate code. We write code on teams, and it's evaluated by other humans who live in the world and have biases. I learned this the hard way and eventually changed my name from Alexandra to Alex to be more gender neutral so that I would stop getting harassed on code forums. So now I go by Alex Chin. This is another thing that I've said. I'd love to hire more women or more immigrants or more older folks, but I don't want to have to lower the bar for my team. And a lot of really well-meaning folks say this. And this statement is actually super insulting because it presupposes that whatever group you're talking about is less good at programming than the majority group, which is simply not true. There's no inherent programming gene. And the truth is, when you hire minorities, you're able to raise the bar of your team because you're hiring from a larger pool of people, right? That makes sense. And then also ask yourself, who sets the bar? What group do they belong to? And how could their biases have come into play when judging who meets the bar? So a young woman once said to me, my male peers always say that I'm taking away their job offers because I'm a woman and tech companies are trying to hire more women right now. And firstly, that's not true. It's harder for a woman to get a job as a software engineer, as shown by the study I cited before. But the problem that people have with that is they don't like the idea of affirmative action. They think it's discriminatory or sexist or racist to favor an underrepresented group over the majority group. But that's wrong. The idea behind affirmative action is to give a boost to those who have been pushed down by the system so that it ends up being actually fair. Like, if you think of two candidates that seem to have the same skill level, but one of them has had to work 2 times harder to get the same opportunities and overcome the challenges that we discussed earlier to end up in what seems to be the same place, do they really have the same skill level? And another way to think about affirmative action is that people in the majority group have been receiving boosts because of their majority group belonging their whole life, like in school, when applying for internships, for jobs, when receiving mentorship. So the boost of affirmative action simply aims to correct this big imbalance, and that's why it's important. And this goes back to the popular concept that African Americans have to be, for example, twice as good as white Americans in order to receive the same opportunities. This is something that I've also said, this women-only hackathon is excluding men. That's not fair. Women should learn to code with men since they have to work with men in a workplace. This is doing them a disservice. There's a lot of safe spaces in tech for minority groups like Lesbians Who Tech or Trans Hack. They're both awesome. But the criticism of safe spaces comes up a lot, and it's generally that they're discriminating against the majority group. Why do people even need these groups? And they make minority groups overly sensitive and doesn't prepare them for real life. But safe spaces for minority groups are important because everyone deserves a safe place in which to do your work and in which to work on what you're passionate about. And if you think about it, most environments are safe spaces for one group of people or another, whether they intend to be or not. Like a programming conference or a hackathon is a really safe space for white and Asian men, even though it's not strictly a men's hackathon, because they're vastly overrepresented and they're expected to do well, and most things are geared towards them. And this is from the TV show Silicon Valley. Other groups need safe spaces too, which is why all women's events, all Black events, all queer events are important. And it might feel kind of unfair and uncool to not be invited to a conference or a party, but that's fine. That's okay. Just learn to live with the feeling of discomfort and understand that that's how folks from underrepresented backgrounds feel when they go to an event where they're scarcely represented. And so as I've said, I've made a ton of mistakes, and that's fine, and the reason it's fine is because I'm committed to always listening to people who have less privilege than me and learning about their experiences and making more mistakes and learning from them. And that's really the most that anyone can do. So once you're committed to making a positive change and you've learned from other folks who have less privilege, you can start to make meaningful and measurable change. And I use the words meaningful and measurable here because they're important. When starting something new, it's really easy to get excited and want to make a ton of changes, but as we learned from Google's failures, it's important to be strategic and make changes that are meaningful, that will actually move the needle, and changes that we can measure. And so this part of the talk will deal with specific and actionable advice on how to build a diverse and inclusive team. So we've talked about the falsehood of the pipeline problem. So we're going to assume that there's enough qualified people from underrepresented backgrounds in tech, and that we're going to focus more on how to attract them, hire them, and retain them, and mentor them. And why are teams homogenous to begin with? It's not really anyone's fault. You're not trying to exclude people. You're not saying, like, no, women don't apply. But we tend to hire our friends, and we hire people that we went to school with, and our friends' friends, and people who fit our culture, and people who have things in common with us. And so lack of diversity on a team, in a lot of cases, happens not on purpose, but on accident. However, diverse and inclusive environments happen on purpose. They happen because that's the intention. And so that's what we're going to talk about doing now. And the common thread along all these recommendations is really like, how can I rethink my company's culture and hiring and management processes in a way that provides equal opportunity for all? And the way to do that is to challenge your assumptions, recognize your biases and when they occur, and to change the system to make sure that it's more fair. And we'll apply this line of thinking throughout different parts of the employee life cycle. So the most important part of starting diversity and inclusion work is to measure progress. We're scientists, we love data, we pride ourselves on being data-driven, so let's be data-driven about diversity. And the first step to making measurable change within your company is measuring where you are. So how will you know if you're successful if you can't measure how far you've come? So that means actually gathering the diversity data on your team. And once you have that, you can set meaningful goals. By how much do you want X percentage to grow? So at Skillshare, we recently started collecting diversity data, and we made the choice to collect gender and race data only to start. And we tried to be as inclusive as possible, so we let people kind of fill in their own identity instead of providing a checklist. And we also gathered data about what team they're on, whether or not they're a manager, whether or not they're in leadership. That way we can identify if there's a glass ceiling, if people are being promoted equally, if we have minorities in leadership positions. And this data informs the goals that you set, just like any metric. Revenue, DAU, MAU, you should be setting diversity goals the same way you set those goals. And you should be ambitious about them, just the same way that you're ambitious about your product goals. So another important place to measure data is your hiring process. If you find that you're unable to hire minorities, do an audit of your hiring process and find out where they're dropping off. Like, how many do you reach out to? How many resumes do you read? How many make it through that? And the phone screen, and the technical interview, and the culture interview. And how many, in the end, get a job? Like, find out where the people are dropping off and then fix that piece of your interview process. And there's a lot of other data that you can gather to make better decisions, and Project Include is a really great resource for how to do that. So creating an inclusive culture is a crucial part of building a diverse team. And as Erica Joy says, who you should follow on Twitter immediately, inclusion is recognizing that there are systems to disfavor underrepresented groups at play in the workplace and working to counteract them. And these pieces of advice will help you create a more inclusive culture. So define and share clear compensation bands. Currently, female software engineers make 30% less than their male counterparts, which is very upsetting to me, personally. If you define and share compensation bands with your team, it'll help ensure that a group of employees isn't paid disproportionately less than another. You should encourage and support employee resource groups, support safe spaces for underrepresented groups to get together and mentor each other. You should promote a healthy work-life balance to embrace all types of employees, like maybe cranking code late into the night is not great for parents. And you should use diversity benefits to attract and retain employees. So, for example, do you provide health services that cover all people, like disabled people and women and parents? If so, make that clear. And then most importantly, you should hire an HR person, and this is super important. HR usually doesn't seem like a big priority for startups, but having one full-time person working on culture, employee happiness, and inclusion goes a really long way. So the only way to make diversity and inclusion happen is to make it a real priority. So how to attract folks from underrepresented groups? This is one of the main issues tech companies voice in failing to build diverse teams. They just can't find the people, but they are there, trust me. And having an inclusive culture is a big piece of attracting them. Sponsoring diverse events is a really good way to send positive signals that you care about this stuff. Explicitly stating in your job descriptions that you value diversity will also send a really strong signal. And once you reach critical mass, i.e. enough minorities on your team that other folks will see it as a safe and supportive environment, they'll gravitate towards your organization. Interviewing is a really big part of the process of building a diverse team, and I think most interview processes are broken. It's subject to a lot of bias, and it can be really stressful for the interviewee. But there are ways we can mitigate all of this. Are you interviewing enough minorities? A study has shown that women are 3 times more likely to get hired if the company is interviewing another woman for the role. Diverse representation throughout the interview process is also important. This sends a really strong signal to your interviewee that you have a diverse team, and it can minimize for stereotype threat. Account for different communication styles and cultural backgrounds. A lot of interviews require that the interviewee brag about themselves, but that's considered impolite in a lot of cultures. And minorities are more likely to experience imposter syndrome, so asking people to rate their skills might not be the best way to get an accurate reflection of their abilities. And we can mitigate stereotype threat during technical interviews by asking candidates about a project that they've worked on that they're proud of. This way, they're reminded that they're skilled and capable before they start your technical question. At Skillshare, we always say that our job during an interview is not to spot weaknesses, but to find strengths. So looking through that lens forces us to work against our immediate biases. And we make sure to determine after the fact whether or not any weaknesses we flagged are coachable. So using a rubric is one of the most important things in my eyes. If you have a rubric that includes all the skills that you're evaluating for with a scale from poor to excellent for each and examples, it'll really help ensure that you're actually evaluating candidates on a predetermined set of skills and not like on culture fit or on a gut feeling. And along with this, interviewers should be trained properly. And last tip, you should really eat before you interview someone. As I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to work against your unconscious biases when you're hungry. So seriously, like eat every time you're going to interview someone. And last but not least, how do we support everyone's career growth equally? We should acknowledge and embrace differences. We don't all have the same cultural backgrounds, communication styles, and personality types, and we need to make sure that managers acknowledge these differences and celebrate them. Team members should be presented with the same opportunities to grow and advance, whether or not they're confident enough to ask for them, whether or not they're introverted or extroverted. And at Skillshare, we talk a lot about the importance of understanding your managee's motivations and their strengths and weaknesses in order to continue to present them with opportunities. You should build confidence and trust. It's a big part of managing someone. Similarly, you need to build trust with your team so that if an issue arises, they will feel comfortable coming to you. Explicit mentorship, sponsorship, and training opportunities should be available to everyone, whether or not they ask for it. And this can be as simple as asking the person you manage, hey, would you like a mentor? Do you know this training is available? Do you know this role is open? And this goes without saying, but fair and equal pay should be available to all. You can't expect to retain people if you're not prepared to pay them fairly. And so the most important takeaway from this part of the talk is, in order to make change, we need to understand that the system is biased towards the majority group. So we need to constantly be challenging our own assumptions about how our workplace operates, recognize our biases and when they occur, and change the system when we identify that. So as I've mentioned, the way to build a diverse and inclusive environment is to care and commit, listen, learn, make mistakes, and then make meaningful and measurable changes. And it sounds like a lot of work, but it shouldn't be harder to hire diverse people than to build self-driving cars. And it really isn't. And hopefully you've gotten some actionable advice from this talk, and you can start to put it into practice in your own workplaces and on your teams. And I encourage you to check out these resources for much more information. They're really fantastic. And as I stated earlier, all this advice is about actively counteracting the systemic discrimination in the tech industry. And I want to close this talk with a quote by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And it's specifically about racism, but it applies to other forms of systemic oppression. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. Our job now is to actively walk in the opposite direction at a high speed. Thank you. I'm Alex Chin, and here are some of the organizations I'm involved with. Thank you.